Hi, and welcome back to Why Intolerance and Extremism Happen and What We Can Do About All the Anger and Division. I'm Teri Kanefield. Thank you for joining me again. This is part 6. In the last section, I talked about the difficulty of a democratic government that protects both individual rights and personal liberty. I suggested that the very difficulty of a democratic form of government, which requires a lot from people, drives people to autocracies and extremist ideologies. They want things easy. They want things to happen fast, or they want everyone to agree with them. There's another dynamic that keeps democracy in danger. When people get power, they often use that power to benefit themselves, which means that democracy is always in danger of sliding into oligarchy. Oligarchy is a situation in which a small group of people have too much power, and obviously democracy won't work well when a small group have disproportionate power. Heather Cox Richardson, in her book, How the South Won the Civil War, points out that the United States has had 2 oligarchies, and we're currently slipping into a third. The first oligarchy occurred during the plantation era, when 1% of the population, large plantation owners, controlled 90% of the nation's wealth and resources. The wealthy enslavers used their wealth and power to protect themselves. The Democratic Party at the time was the party of the Confederates in rural America. The Democrats wanted a limited federal government because they were afraid that the North, if given the chance and if given too much power, would end slavery. So they vetoed federal funds for infrastructure such as canals and highways because they understood that such infrastructure would strengthen the industrial North. Their argument was that the Constitution didn't give the federal government the power to do things across states. In 1855, the Republican Party, called the Freedom Party, was born as an anti-slavery, pro-industry, pro-federal government party. After the Civil War and the crushing defeat of the South, the Republicans had the power to pass pro-industry legislation. They built the kind of infrastructure, roads, interstate highways, canals, that enabled businesses to thrive. Republicans, by the way, gave us our first income tax. As a result of this new infrastructure and new policies, we had an industrial revolution. A few people, who became known as business tycoons or robber barons, grew wealthy. They often used ruthless business practices, which were made possible because there were essentially no regulations. They could fix prices. They could manipulate markets. Unregulated banks freely lent too much money. Because a few people had disproportionate wealth and power, it was also our second oligarchy. The theory that allowed for this was called laissez-faire economics, or free market economy. The theory holds that the economy works best when government doesn't interfere. It's the idea that you just let it happen. What will be, will be. Free market proponents were the ones who argued that personal liberty means that if a worker agrees to work 10 hours a day for a few pennies, it's none of the government's business. They also argued that if employers offer bad working conditions, people would look for other jobs. After all, slavery was now illegal, so the market would take care of the problem. In other words, the government didn't have to and shouldn't do anything about unsafe or bad working conditions. They also claimed that taxing businesses penalized high levels of production. Some proponents of a free market economy argue that nature naturally forms a hierarchy. The strong and capable rise to the top. They believe that when the government attempts to boost the weak or the poor, the government is helping the weak at the expense of the strong. Taxing the wealthy to pay for welfare strikes them as stealing from the rich and giving to the poor. They believe the wealthy should be encouraged to donate to charities, and many of the tycoons were also philanthropists, but they believe they should not be forced to donate. This has been expressed as the makers and takers theory. The idea is that the makers are those who produce, and the takers are, to use Ayn Rand's term, looters. Liberal views about labor and distributing income hit a fairly large glitch when the communist revolution in Russia went off the rails, allowing free market proponents to paint anything which smacked of communism as evil and scary. Meanwhile, laborers worked long hours in dangerous jobs at poverty wages. There was no minimum wage, no 40-hour work week, no Social Security, no worker protections. So while a few people were fabulously wealthy, many others labored in poverty. If you're curious about how the parties essentially switched platforms, here is part of how it happened. At the beginning of the 20th century, the Republican Party split into two factions, the pro-industry part and the pro-civil rights part that also became the pro-labor part. By the 1920s, the pro-industry part took control of the Republican Party. The Republicans dropped racial equality and labor issues from its platform and became the party of business. The Democratic Party base at the time was still former Confederates, so neither party in this era embraced civil rights. The age of business came tumbling down in 1929 when Wall Street crashed, followed by the Great Depression. Enter, stage left, Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his pro-labor New Deal. The New Deal offered worker protections, a minimum wage, a 40-hour work week. That's when we got Social Security. The GI Bill, for example, essentially educated a generation and moved lots of people into the middle class. As a result of all of this, the middle class was strengthened, income inequality came down, and we moved out of the second oligarchy. Meanwhile, the parties continued shifting. Roosevelt drew many Black Americans into the Democratic coalition because they liked his pro-labor stance. Republicans, in contrast, pushed back against the pro-labor New Deal. Then, beginning with President Truman, the Democratic Party began turning toward civil rights. As the Democratic Party under Truman began embracing civil rights, many Democrats found themselves at odds with the Democratic Party. A group in the South called themselves Dixie Democrats or Dixiecrats. They were opposed to things like integration. Meanwhile, free market proponents found that their economic policies were unpopular. People liked things like Social Security and worker protections. To pull together a large coalition, Nixon and Reagan invited the Dixiecrats into the party. The Republican Party became the party of fiscal conservatives, people who were anti-regulation and against taxes, and social conservatives, people who didn't want to integrate and who did things like blame the women's movement for destroying what they called the traditional family. What the two groups had in common was a dislike of the federal government and the new powers that the federal government was taking on. Recall that the civil rights movement happened almost entirely through the federal government. This was the final shift in the parties, bringing the Democratic Party full circle from the party of the Confederacy to the party of civil rights and urban America. So the shifting of the party is another source of flux and another reason labels have limits. People shift. Parties shift. In the 1980 presidential election, Carter versus Reagan, I did some political polling. My job was to call the voters in a small town in Missouri. I believe I called them all. I'm originally from Missouri. I had conversations like this. Me, what's your political affiliation? Town resident. I'm a Democrat. My daddy was a Democrat and my granddaddy was a Democrat. Me, who will you be voting for president? Town resident. Ronald Reagan. Me, you do realize that Reagan is a Republican and Carter is a Democrat, right? Town resident laughs and says, I'm not voting for Carter. In other words, I was watching this shift happen. What has been called Reaganomics marked the beginning of a movement back toward deregulation. Reagan economics also meant tax cuts. Businesses benefited, but Reaganomics ushered in an era of increasing economic inequality. Today, income inequality is reaching levels similar to those in the 1920s, and we are edging toward our third oligarchy. I'll go ahead and call this a theory, even though I think it's a fact. Regulated capitalism is the best economic system for our modern world. Regulated capitalism offers the benefits of capitalism. Innovation is fostered, economic growth is promoted, and opportunities expand. Wider choices are available to consumers. Regulating capitalism creates more fairness, which increases the benefits of capitalism by preventing things like market manipulation, insider trading, false advertising, and worker exploitation. If cheating isn't allowed, genuine innovation is encouraged. The prize goes to the true innovators instead of those who figure out how to manipulate and cheat others. Regulation allows for more freedom and opportunity because more people have the opportunity to participate. However, as you would expect, some capitalists don't want to be regulated. Companies will frequently come out on the side of profits over the public good. We will make less profit, but the general population will benefit is, I assume, rarely the consensus of a corporate board of directors. So, there's a constant push and pull between those who want industry to be regulated and those who think the economy works best when it is unregulated. This tendency to slip into oligarchy is another reason democracies are always in flux and in danger. Many of the founders who called themselves anti-federalists believed the lesson to glean from the ancient democracies of Greece and Rome is that democracy thrives best when citizens share a common climate and culture. This is why many of them believed that power should remain local. Certainly, a small group of people who share a climate and culture will have less pushing and pulling than a large, sprawling, multicultural, diverse democracy. But even with small groups, democracy is difficult. I was on a nonprofit board and there was much conflict. As the saying goes, if you put two people in a room, you'll get three opinions. The existence pain of democracy includes knowing that our world is messy, imperfect, in constant flux, and that democracy is never easy. People overwhelmed by the messiness or unable to handle complexity may long for a leader who they believe can restore order. People are imperfect, but they want perfection. This leads them to seek an ideology to mask the pain of seeing an imperfect world. Remember Karen Stenner's theory that the worldwide rise of authoritarian movements has happened because liberal democracy has exceeded many people's capacity to tolerate it. Until recently, in our evolutionary history, humans were concerned only with their immediate surroundings. The world was a simpler place. Humans knew that large predatory cats were dangerous, they knew that the neighboring group might make war on them, and they knew which berries were good to eat. Today, our lives are interconnected with people who live on the other side of the planet. Evolutionary biologists and neuroscientists tell us that our brains are poorly equipped to deal with globalization. Put another way, our technology is in danger of outpacing our wisdom to manage it. If life is hard, people may look for someone to blame. Such people are vulnerable to the call of a demagogue. A person who can't hold a job as a casual laborer may be taught to blame immigrants for taking his job. A man continually rejected by women can be taught to blame the changes that have made women independent. Liberals and progressives are always introducing new ideas or trying to improve what is there, while conservatives resist change and regressives feel that something is being lost and they try to undo the change. Even people who are mostly liberal can start feeling like, okay, now things have gone too far. There may be more people like that than we realize because they may be afraid to say how they feel. Consider these messages. People are coming to take our jobs. People less qualified than us are coming to take our jobs, and it isn't fair. What is essentially American is being lost. The cities are teeming with crime, immorality, and vice, such as drug use. We are being invaded by foreigners who want to change America into something else. We need to protect women's sports. Trust science. There are only two genders. Some people who respond to the above messages may have a vague feeling of unease or discomfort or fear without understanding the source of those fears and anxieties. Things have moved too quickly, so they are uncomfortable. They don't understand globalism. They're uneasy with all this stuff about gender and pronouns. They want easy answers to complex questions. In the hands of skilled demagogues, Those kinds of messages, which play on fears that come from rapid changes, can send a person into an ideological spiral. I always turn back to the artist because artists often express wisdom in a way that resonates deeply because they do it in symbol and metaphor. Some do it through stories. Art is condensed life. The musical, South Pacific, tackled the issue of racism in 1949. The story is about how people often resist what is new and different. One of the main characters, Nellie, overcomes her prejudice after she spends time with children who are different and she becomes comfortable with them. In the notes, I put a link to the song, You've Got to Be Carefully Taught. You've got to be carefully taught is exactly what the neuroscientists also tell us. For an ideology to take root, it has to be continually reinforced. When the play was first performed on Broadway, racial segregation was legal. The modern civil rights movement was in the future. There was pressure on Rodgers and Hammerstein to remove the song, You've Got to Be Carefully Taught, because it was considered too controversial. James Michener, the author of the book on which the play was based, later recalled that Rodgers and Hammerstein replied stubbornly that the number represented why they wanted to do the play, and even if it meant failure of the production, the number was going to stay in. The song so offended some lawmakers that they introduced a bill to outlaw entertainment having, quote, an underlying philosophy inspired by Moscow. By that, they meant communist, and by that, they meant going against what they believed was essentially American. The song begins with these words. It's not born in you. It happens after you are born. You've got to be taught to hate and fear. You've got to be taught from year to year to hate all the people your relatives hate. You've got to be carefully taught. I put a link in the notes so that you can listen to the entire song. I think there's a lot of wisdom in it. I'll stop here. Next time, I'll pick up with the dangers of panic and constant outrage. Thank you for listening, and I hope you'll be back for part 7.